Heartbeat Podcast, a podcast about health, politics, and society.
Welcome to Heartbeat Podcast, Episode 11. I'm Arlana Shikongo, joined by my co-host, Ramya Kumar. In this episode, we are going to look at compliance with the COVID-19 regulations and urban equity issues. More specifically, the inconsistencies in the enforcement of these regulations. We'll be exploring this with our special guest, urban studies expert, Dr. Guillermo Delgado, who is the Land, Livelihoods and Housing Program Coordinator for the Integrated Land Management Institute at the Namibia University of Science and Technology.
Thank you, Arlana.
I think the situation with COVID-19 exposes general situation or status quo with regards to urban governance in Namibia today. In general, there is one can say that the paradigm is slowly changing from being from a paradigm where there are stark divisions between the authority and the governed to a more kind of inclusive, participatory way of executing and implementing and thinking about urban development. We're still a long way, but there are good examples where the inhabitants and local authorities partner to procure inclusive urban development. So now this crisis of COVID-19 exposes those tensions, and I would like to speak a little bit more about that.
I mean, we know that trust in public health is essential if we want the public to adopt prevention strategies. And many of the prevention strategies for COVID have been difficult and disruptive. We've been closing small businesses. We've been doing physical distancing. We have a curfew in Namibia. And I think the public really must believe the law enforcement has the best interest of the public in mind in order to trust law enforcement. And so these kind of incidences of marketeers being rustled up by the police, are these maintaining or eroding trust?
I think it goes both ways in the sense that the authorities should be trusted, but the authorities also need to trust inhabitants. I think just as a background in Namibia, about 2/3 of those who are considered to be employed in Namibia, according to official statistics, find themselves in the informal sector. So it is by far, you could say, the largest sector of the informal sector. Now, this doesn't mean that 2/3 of the population are street traders. You can have that's a very narrow definition of the informal sector, but definitely a lot of people, the majority of people, especially in informal settlements, have a livelihood in some form of informal trade, which can be home-based, but can also be street vendors. And these are groups that can be engaged and can be trusted. And I think in the sense that I've seen just as many small traders in the corners having a bottle of sanitizers next to them and abiding with social distancing rules. So I think that needs to be something that needs to be also understood by authorities, that ordinary traders on the street can be engaged meaningfully to ensure the necessary prevention measures that are so much needed these days. And then in this way you can actually have, I guess, a healthy social contract between authorities and ordinary inhabitants. But as we mentioned earlier, there's still a long way for that kind of status to be really achieved.
I guess I just wanted to follow up with another question where, Dr. Delgado, you said that there are examples of local authorities and communities partnering together. And it seems in Windhoek there might be some erosion of trust in the law enforcement with these viral videos going around. So how can the city of Windhoek at this time rebuild public trust together with public health officials and law enforcement?
Ironically, although the city of Windhoek is by far the largest urban area, and by far the biggest local authority and the most capacitated one, the one with the largest budget. Its record on inclusive strategies is not very good. When we mean inclusive development, we mean really local authorities coming to the table to engage with organized groups of inhabitants and low-income groups to co-develop strategies and implement them together. There are good examples in other local authorities, smaller ones in the coast, in the central areas, and in the northeastern areas of the country. But unfortunately, Windhoek has not a very good reputation on engaging meaningfully inhabitants, particularly low-income groups of inhabitants that by far constitute the vast majority of those living in Windhoek. So this record is not something that inhabitants will, is not something that you can fix quickly. I think this is an everyday practice that you stimulate through inclusive strategies, for example, informal settlement upgrading, provision of services, and the way that authorities engage with informal traders. So fortunately in Windhoek, it will be difficult to kind of create this kind of amicable social contract between informal traders and the local authorities. But I have confidence that in other local authorities there is a bit more potential for interesting joint initiatives.
Dr. Delgado, I think you make a very good point, and something that I think that maybe we can focus on a little bit more for this part of our discussion. But you had mentioned healthy social contracts. And I would agree with you that Windhoek, the city doesn't have a very good relationship between the authorities and especially the lower income groups, which is why we're seeing this now manifest in the way that our informal traders are being treated. So in thinking about a healthy social construct, like what advice can be given to both the authorities and to the informal traders, or to the people who find themselves in these pockets of society where they're always having exchanges with the police? What can be done? Because my question really is, what are people at, say, these more private open markets doing differently from the informal traders, that they're treated with a little bit more dignity and respect, even when we're seeing so much contravention of these regulations in their spaces?
So cities are really sites of social struggle where the interests are negotiated every day. So we know that there are complaints of formal markets, the bigger shops and retailers about that address formally the city to basically decry how informal trade affects their business. So I think that this is just an example on how these interests need to be negotiated, because there needs to be a kind of coexistence. It cannot be that this sector, as I mentioned, is not negligible, but it's actually what puts bread on the table for the majority of inhabitants here in Namibia. So there needs to be an understanding that we need to negotiate, because inhabitants will come to the table. We also have good practice in engaging inhabitants with sanitation and health prevention measures. So it's not impossible. There's evidence of this. So I think the city should shift from a punitive approach, basically a prohibitive kind of way of conducting itself, for more of an engagement kind of approach, where something is offered in exchange, not just an indication of prohibition, but some kind of remediating measure, so that the trading can continue while abiding by the necessary measures that are necessary in these times.
Which one would think would not be a difficult thing to do. as we're seeing that, there is this symbiotic relationship between more private markets and the authorities and how those things are treated. And I think that, when those two very different occurrences exist in this kind of setting, it only eats away more at public trust. So it would seem that it's not that the authorities don't have the capacity to approach these people in a way that is dignified. It's just that they're choosing to go the route of being aggressive and being violent, which I think again speaks to the level of trust perhaps that they have for these traders, and why it is that their trust is so much lower for them than it is for other sectors of, the economy.
I agree. I think there's a general approach in the kind of, we can call it the formal sector, like authorities and formal trade, that informal trade needs to be substituted, needs to resemble the formal sector, should get licenses, should get the permits, and should be modeled in the image of the formal. Whereas actually I think the informal is precisely informal because the formal does not cater for everybody. And I think the authorities miss the point when they force the measures that are very much modeled on the informal sector. There was this case in which the chief of police was complaining that some informal traders that had a license to trade in certain area would then move to another area, and then they would be in principle breaking the law, whereas if the law is not really kind of responsive to the realities of informal trade. Informal trade is mobile, and if there's a construction site here today, then there will be small food vendors in this construction site today. If the construction site moves to another building is finished, and then there's another building site elsewhere, the traders will move. It would not make sense for the traders to stay in a place where there are no customers. So the basic, it's not very well understood, the very nature of the informal to basically develop adequate legislation, if that is even something that is desirable. I think, as I said, there's kind of like a hope that one day there will be formal jobs for everybody, and then there will be no informal traders in the street one day. But I think more and more there is a kind of recognition that will not be the case, or that in the medium or even long term. So I think it's high time to actually engage and listen carefully to the informal trade. And in the context of the pandemic, there was something that you could regard as a positive thing. The Namibian government has always tried to avoid calling informal trade as such. They would always use euphemisms such as small and medium enterprise or micro enterprise, but they would not address them as such. But when the pandemic started, and it was clear that something needed to be done with formal trade, the government started to actually call them as such, and started to make regulation and legislation very clearly outlining informal trade as such. I think that speaks of some recognition that needs to be expanded to be able to meaningfully engage these inhabitants that by all means have human rights and cannot be treated in the way that are being treated so far.
Absolutely, because I would add to that recognition without context does not provide solutions, or does not provide rather amicable solutions. If you don't have the context of what goes into that person getting there to be able to make their bread for the day, I don't think that you'll be able to find a solution that is both fitting for yourself and your needs as the authorities, as well as those of the trader.
Absolutely, and I think that the shift is really one between a mental conception where we substitute informal traders, informal settlements with formal trade and formal neighborhoods, as if that would be even possible, whereas to one that is a paradigm of upgrading. In other words, you don't substitute an informal settlement with a neighborhood like would be like a formal neighborhood, but you assist inhabitants to upgrade their living conditions themselves with some infrastructure. Similarly, in informal trade, you would actually people by the sheer act of going out to trade in very difficult conditions in many instances, it's evidence that inhabitants are actually doing their best to upgrade themselves. So they should that they should be met halfway because that's kind of like a form of economic development. Informal trade in Namibia needs to start be seen as a form of economic development, and local economic development strategies and national employment creation strategies should actually have very, very, very strong components on how are informal traders going to be assisted and stimulated, and indeed in the context of the pandemic, how are they going to be helped to, because of course the situation is more difficult for everybody, including them. So they need actually assistance like anybody else, and that is something that is definitely something that is still missing.
Absolutely.
To add, I just really like the points that you brought up, that the informal trade really are a majority of the population that put bread on the table. And I thought that was a good point that Dr. Delgado says that the city should shift from a punitive approach to an engagement approach. And I guess, is there any benefit to, revamping or renaming informal trade to micro-enterprise, and maybe kind of fostering a sense of pride in what informal traders do, and maybe leveraging that as well as concern for their own and concern for their community, which would also help with kind of COVID preventative measures like maintaining physical distance and wearing a mask.
I was actually in a session last week in a conference that took place online on Southern African cities, and there was a session specifically focused on informal trade. There were colleagues from Zambia, from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, and Namibia. And the Namibian colleague is here, based at NOS, and he was making an important point. He was saying that informal, when one calls something informal, it's a way of othering that thing that one is referring to. It's saying you're not part of us, you are different, you are outside. Whereas we know that informal traders, to call them in some way, are very much part of the economic system in Namibia. And one important moment that I remember at the beginning of the pandemic was when the formal businesses mobilized through the Namibia Chamber of Commerce immediately gathered to make a plan and a proposal for the government on how could government help them, because of course they already anticipated they would make losses and the business would be affected. And basically I saw the document, and the document was saying basically, help us because we are creating employment in Namibia. Now, I do agree, they're creating employment, but the situation in Namibia, as I said, is such in which it's just a very, very, very small minority that is actually formally employed in this country. So, how could be that informal traders could be actually helped to in the context of this pandemic? And I think this kind of division between the formal and the formal, it's, I think, not very productive. And my colleague that presented in this conference was actually arguing that it's classist, and it's also in the context of places where there was apartheid, like South Africa or Namibia. It's also racist, because of course we know that most of the informal traders are actually blacks and disadvantaged. So he was actually making a very interesting point about how the use of calling something on that's informal has so many connotations and should not. And he was proposing that it needs to be questioned, and in the context of urban governance and strategies, it needs to be seen as part of the mainstream strategies. They need to be regarded as a stakeholder in the equation, and they need the support that is so much needed in these pandemic times.
I think that Dr. Delgado has spoken really nicely about the challenges that the informal sector has faced, not only in the context of the pandemic, but with law enforcement and inequities and how the law is enforced. So I don't have any further questions, Arlana.
Thank you both for making the time for this Zoom meeting. Dr. Delgado, very much appreciate your insight and your time as well. And we look forward to talking to you more at a later point in time about some more COVID-related things.
Thank you very much, Alana and Ramia.
So that was our discussion with Dr. Guillermo Delgado, who encourages healthy social contracts between the public, the government, and law enforcement. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's Heartbeat podcast. Arlana Shikongo signing off.